Sir Vince Cable is a politician who was leader of the Liberal Democrats from 2017 to 2019, Member of Parliament for Twickenham and Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills for 5 years. And I'm delighted to have him on the show just now. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. It's very dull here, but I'm getting on with some useful work inside.
Nice. And you've got some nice paintings there behind you, I see.
Yes, I think on your right, I think, is a nice picture of Shetland. It may not be recognisable, but I value having good pictures on the wall.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, growing up, did you ever aspire to be a politician and get involved in politics, or was it something that just sort of happened?
No, there was a mixture of the two. I mean, I think when I was at school, I was beginning to develop an interest in politics. It was mainly as a result of arguing that my father was a very right-wing conservative, and I took a somewhat different view, age 13 plus, on the empire and Suez and things of this kind. So I got used to debating politics with him, and I suppose I had an aspiration to play a role. It wasn't initially so much in sort of parliamentary terms. I mean, I was a teenage actor, and I got used to the idea of being on the stage and making speeches and so on. So it developed that way. Then at university, I was sort of acting in politics and in the debating union. I became president of the union, and so I suppose by my early 20s, I'd become part of what people now call the political class.
Yeah. And growing up with a father that you disagreed with a lot, do you think that maybe helped you prepare for maybe debates with people that you don't necessarily agree with?
Yes, it did. I mean, if you look at the biographies of most politicians, they actually tend to follow their parents. Yeah. But, there are some people who react against it. I mean, I did. And as it happens, I had I spent my early teenage life debating with my father over the dinner table, often in a very bad-tempered way. Yeah. But my best friend was a communist. So actually, I was, from a fairly early stage, I was looking for a sort of compromise between the two.
Yeah. And your father, I guess, he was also a bit of an aspirational man, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was, I had my disagreements with him, but he was impressive in his way. I mean, he was a very hard-working, family-devoted, very much into thrift and hard work and aspiration, including for me. So I owe a lot to my father.
Yeah, and as you were growing up, you moved to bigger and bigger houses.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we started in what you could call the working class. He and my mother were doing kind of manual jobs, and we had an outside loo and a terrace house and all that. But, as we progressed through my childhood, he progressed professionally and started teaching building trades at a tech college. Yeah. And I, did well, went past the 11 plus, was a system at that time. And we became more socially kind of low middle class rather than working class. And bigger and bigger houses and more aspiration.
And I guess most people probably know you best for Parliament and government and things, but you had a bit of a long career before eventually becoming an MP, because you were a councillor in Maryhill in Glasgow for many years, weren't you?
Yeah, well, it took me 30 years from when I first stood for Parliament in Glasgow to actually becoming an MP. 30 long years. I only got in when I was 54. So I've got an old man by many standards. Yeah. So in the meantime, I did all kinds of things and travelled around the world, did different jobs in academia, think tanks, and then eventually in Shell, I was their chief economist and, travelled the world with them, looking at, business opportunities in China, India, Nigeria, Russia. And then, so, I'd already had quite a good career, was reasonably well paid. And more important, actually, is I had had opportunity to devote to my family and had a kind of loving relationship. And sadly, my wife died shortly after I became an MP. But we had a good family and children who grew up in a good way. So I didn't feel my time was wasted outside of political life.
Yeah. And, you spent 30 years trying to get into Parliament, and I think it was your 5th attempt you got in. So you never sort of gave up. I guess you really wanted to be there.
Yes, I think I also had a lot of support from my wife. I mean, she felt we'd given up a lot for my political hobby, if that was what we called it, particularly when I was travelling 200 miles every weekend to stand in York, which is my hometown, where I stood for the SDP Liberal Alliance in the 80s. And I think she felt I should keep going. And when I had an opportunity to stand in Twickenham, which is where we lived, even though she was ill and I was spending a lot of my time as a carer, we kept the ambition alive. And in the 1997 big Lib Dem breakthrough, I got elected as part of that tsunami.
Yeah. And then in 2010, when there was the coalition, which came about after the result, you ended up being business secretary as a part of that. But what was your reaction to the result, actually? Because I guess it's the only election I can think of where it could have been Conservative, Labour or Lib Dem as the biggest party when it was done. But in the end, Lib Dem actually lost a couple of seats, didn't they? So were you shocked by the result?
Yeah, we lost more than a couple of seats. I think it was 7 or 8. It was a particular shock because during that campaign, you may not remember, but for a while at the beginning, after the debates in which Nick Clegg was given the equal status with Gordon Brown and David Cameron, we were briefly in the lead. I mean, great things were seen as possible, but it all sort of ebbed away towards election day. And we finished up with about 22% of the popular vote, which is pretty good, but it wasn't enough to get more seats. And actually, we went backwards a bit. And the outcome in terms of seats in 2010 was particularly cruel because we were a few more seats for the opposition, and I think we probably have formed a coalition with Labour, but the numbers were not there. I think a lot of us, some of us anyway, I would certainly have favoured a coalition with Gordon Brown. We certainly discussed it with him, I did, but it wasn't possible. The arithmetic wasn't there. And of course, the additional complication was that we had a major economic crisis. There was a lot of pressure on me and other leading Lib Dems to come to a quick agreement to tackle the economic problems.
Yeah. Am I right in saying that even though you lost seats in that election, your share of the popular vote actually went up?
Fractionally, yes. I think it was about 22, 23%. I mean, and that in a way illustrates the absurdity of the British electoral system. I mean, we had, over 20% of the vote. We had, I think, 54 MPs out of 650, and less than 10%. I mean, it just shows, how unrepresentative Parliament actually is. And we suffered from that, as do other small parties. I mean, the Greens have a fairly solid following of about 5%, but they only have 1 MP. The system, as it is at the moment, strongly favours the Conservatives and also the Scottish Nationalists because their support is highly concentrated.
Would you say that the coalition between you and the Conservative Party was a successful government overall?
Yes and no. I mean, the yes was that the government was stable. I mean, we stuck together for 5 years. It was difficult. But we worked efficiently, decisions were made. There may have been quite a lot of ideological difference. There was differences on policy, but we always reconciled them and went ahead and implemented the policies that we thought we were right. I mean, no, in the sense that it was very bad for the Lib Dems. We suffered appallingly at the end of it. And we were forced into making a whole lot of policy choices that had we been on our own or with other parties, we would not have made. Yeah.
And as business secretary, are there any big achievements that stand out to you during that time?
Yes, I think there are quite a lot. I mean, I sort of introduced what we call the industrial strategy. put a lot of emphasis on the car industry, the aerospace industry, offshore wind, infrastructure, other things, which, were very successful. I set up the Green Investment Bank. Fortunately, the Tories subsequently sold it. Set up the British Business Bank that was critical to financing business through the pandemic. And the Catapult Network, which provides a lot of funding for the big innovation hubs in the UK. So, and there was a lot to show for it. And my colleagues in government, my Lib Dem colleagues, introduced big reforms helping pensioners. That's Steve Webb, raising the threshold for low earners for paying tax. A lot of emphasis on mental health. I mean, we did some good things, but unfortunately we were compromised by being pushed into some very bad decisions as well.
Yeah, that's the thing. I guess there's so much stuff that you maybe would have wanted to do, but because you were in a coalition, you couldn't.
Well, it was partly that, of course, and partly the financial position. I mean, we took a view at the beginning of the coalition, which was very much the advice we received from all the top civil servants and economic advisors at the time, that we had to pursue a policy of tightening the budget deficit, what's subsequently been called austerity, and it led to some painful and difficult decisions. But in the context in which we operate, we didn't feel we really had any choice.
Yeah. And on the other hand, I know it's maybe not the best idea to look back with hindsight, but is there anything during that time that you would go back and change?
Well, the things that I fought for at the time and where we didn't succeed is that I think we sacrificed a lot of public investment. And I think Britain is very badly served with infrastructure, communications infrastructure, particularly in some of the depressed parts of the UK, railway systems. We could have pushed ahead with that, and it would have been consistent with reducing the current account deficit of the budget. But the Treasury took a very negative view and stopped it. I certainly very much regret that. Had we had more money, it might have been possible to head off some of the troubles we run into with student fees, though the priorities which I established in higher education, further education, I think were right. In other words, we're trying to protect further education, college and adult education from the full force of the cuts. So it fell on to higher education students.
Yes. At the 2015 election, as you've sort of touched on, it probably wasn't the best result for the Lib Dems because a lot of seats were lost, including yours. So how did that feel to go from being in government, being the business secretary, to then having no seat at all?
Well, it was fairly traumatic. I mean, in a way, it was less traumatic for me personally than a lot of other of my colleagues because I was already, in my 70s by that point. I was retirement age, and there were a lot of things I wanted to do, writing books, articles. I had a very happy home life. I'd remarried. And I was enjoying spending time like that. So it didn't hit me in the way that it hit some others. I mean, Jo Swinson, for example, both she and her husband lost their seats, lost their jobs on the same night, and they had a young baby and had to look after the family. So some of those guys really had a hard time. But I think the 2015 election was quite important historically, and I don't think too many people understood quite why it happened that way. I mean, it was partly a reaction to the coalition where the Lib Dems were concerned, but shortly before the election, we thought we would get away with about 30 seats from 54. It would have been a hit, but not a catastrophe. But what happened during the election campaign was the Tories very ruthlessly said, well, if you don't vote Conservative, You may like your local Lib Dem MP, but if you don't vote Conservative, you're going to get Red Miliband and the SNP. And, people in Conservative-facing areas, like mine, where we were up against the Tories, a lot of people just deserted us and went in with the Tories. I think they regretted it, but that's what happened.
Yeah. And what actually made you want to go back and contest your seat again in 2017, as opposed to maybe just retire?
Well, many of my colleagues did just retire, and they've made other lives, and I respect that. I don't know. I was motivated by a wish to get even, actually, partly. I didn't feel it was a good way to end. I mean, I'd worked very hard as an MP and built up a good reputation locally. And just to be dumped like that as a result of what I thought was a fairly unscrupulous campaign by the Tory party, not the local candidate, who was very nice, but the party nationally. And I wanted to fight back. And in addition, I was still the candidate in situ. I hadn't given it up at that point. We didn't expect an election to be called, but Theresa May called one early, surprisingly. And I was in place. So my local party thought it would be easier running with me than finding a new candidate. And so I found myself back in Parliament with a big majority.
Did you expect to win the seat back, or did you have to maybe try and do a lot more campaigning than you perhaps would have?
No, we had a very good campaign, and the Lib Dems as a party in London put a lot of effort into it, which I was very grateful for. I expected to win, but not to win. I won with a very large majority. 12,000. Or something of that order, which was, way beyond my wildest expectations.
Yeah. And you went even further that year, actually, and became leader of the Lib Dems. What made you want to become leader?
Well, there was a sense, I think, amongst all the more experienced MPs who were there, we only had 12, that this was a bit of a poison chalice. We were still rebuilding or trying to get off the ground after two very difficult general elections. I didn't, in the end, have any competition for the job. The other potential candidates, who were Joe Swinson and Ed Davey, pulled out and left it to me. I suspect they saw it as a very difficult job, and they were quite happy to leave it to me. But I saw what the task was, which was to rebuild the party and local government, trying to get us a hearing, which is very difficult when you're down to 12 MPs. And I think after 2 years, we'd actually got there. We had a spectacularly good result in local elections. We did very, very well in the European elections, got record numbers of MEPs. We were effectively the competition to Nigel Farage. So we got to a very good position, and I was happy at that point to stand aside and let the next generation take over.
Yeah. Why do you think the local elections and European elections were so successful? Was it just as simple as being the anti-Brexit party?
Well, that certainly helped. Yeah, for sure. That certainly helped. And we did well, especially in parts of the country that were strongly Remain. But not only. Some of our most spectacular results were in Leave areas, and not just in the relatively prosperous south of England, but elsewhere. For example, cities like Hull, very, very Brexity, if you like that language. That's one to the Lib Dems as well. We're just very well organised, had very good campaigning, and a lot of Lib Dems are fantastic community campaigners, and they've been at it for years. So we had it was more than just being an anti-Brexit party. Certainly that helped.
Yeah, and the EU elections, I suppose, are a more proportional system, so you would certainly appear to do better than you would for a general election. Yes,
well, it was a very strange election. If you remember, the Conservatives didn't want it. They didn't really try.
Yeah.
The real issue was what was going to happen to the anti-Brexit vote. And at the beginning, it was fragmented between us, the Labour Party, this new party, Change UK, and the Greens. But I think there was an understanding that we were much more committed, less ambiguous than the Labour Party. and that we had a much better chance of winning than the Greens or Change UK. So, the combination of factors.
Yeah. Being anti-Brexit, what would your sort of goal be in that sense? Would it be to hold another referendum or cancel it altogether?
Well, the cancelling altogether did become the party policy. I think wrongly, actually. I think it was a bad mistake. No, the campaign was to have what we called a confirmatory referendum, that Britain had voted to leave narrowly, but people had a better idea by 2019 what Brexit was going to mean. And so we wanted a referendum on that. That was our policy. And I think had we stuck with that in the subsequent election, we'd have done rather better.
Are you optimistic, even though you supported Remain, or are you still maybe pessimistic? How are you feeling?
Well, on the European issue, I don't think there's any appetite at the moment to reopen the issue. I think it's a sort of peculiar state of affairs where I think there's now a quite substantial majority who feel it was a mistake, who can see all the costs and see very few benefits. But I think the country was just so exhausted with 3 years of bad-tempered debate on the subject that they just don't want to reopen it. And I think very understandable that the Labour Party in particular, but even the Lib Dems, are not now clamouring for re-entry. I mean, it may happen. I think 10 years or something, there may be a fresh set of people having a look at this anew. And maybe not just rejoining the European Union as it was, but looking for a close relationship along the lines that, say, Norway currently has. I think, looking a decade ahead, that's maybe what will happen.
Yeah. And you led your party into the EU elections, of course, and the local elections, but you didn't into a general election. You retired as party leader shortly before the 2019 election, even though you wouldn't have really known it was coming up. Would you have wanted to lead the party into a general election?
Well, if we'd known that there was going to be an early election, I would have stood. But the calculation I made was that it was going to be another 2 years, 2+ years. I was going to be, almost 80. Yeah. I'm not sure I wanted to stand yet again for another 5 years. And Jo Swinson was in the wings. She was my deputy. I think she was then ready to stand. So I was happy to stand aside and pass the baton in an orderly way to someone else.
Yeah. Now, how would you rate the current government's response to COVID and the pandemic?
Well, as they themselves will claim, there has been a successful vaccination program, and it's why Britain is in a better position than many others. Yeah. But the overall response has been rather shambolic. I think when you're looking at different ways of dealing with pandemics, you can have the Chinese way, which is, very tough and rather authoritarian and controlling, but has the potential to more or less eliminate deaths, which is what they've done. Or you can have a much more liberal approach. And I suppose the best example was Sweden, where they've relied very heavily on people's sense of responsibility and self-discipline and concern for other people. And they haven't done badly, but rather better than us. And then the British have had a bit of each, in a rather kind of unconvincing way. And we've had 150,000 people who've died, some of them, or quite a lot of them unnecessarily, not quite as bad as the United States, which is 1 million, and some other countries much worse. But so it's a mixed story, not great. And I do worry a little bit about the last few months, that although it's great that we've emerged into a much freer environment, and we're most of us, large majority now vaccinated, all of this seems to have been undertaken without scientific advice. And we relied through the pandemic on the scientists to tell us what to do, or advisors, and they've suddenly disappeared. And I just worry that this is all a bit sort of political, and there could be a nasty backlash in a few months' time if, say, a new strain of COVID appears.
And the thing everyone's talking about at the moment, of course, is Partygate. What do you make of all that?
Well, it's a terrible mess. and it sort of underlines for many people what is Mr. Johnson's worst failing, which is his gross dishonesty and just an unwillingness to be straight with people. And it led to a kind of morally unacceptable position where the government's preaching one thing and doing another. So I think the Tory MPs would like him to go, but they're not willing to move on that because they can't absolutely be sure there will be an orderly succession to somebody better.
Would you like him to go?
Well, it's not a personal thing. I think he ought to. And I think they have people who are much better and who would give the Labour Party and my party a bigger run for their money at the next election, but they seem afraid to put the knife into him.
Yeah. Here we go then. Who are your favourite politicians outside of the Lib Dems?
Well, I worked with some very good Conservatives in government. I think probably Ken Clarke was somebody I had great admiration for. He's a cabinet colleague and did a lot of good work over the years. And on the Labour side, I was actually quite a fan of Gordon Brown. I thought, somebody of great integrity and idealism, and who actually accomplished quite a lot in his period in government.
And also, you appeared on a Christmas special of Strictly Come Dancing. I understand you have taken a bit of an interest in dancing over the years, actually.
Yeah, and I still do it. I mean, I have a weekly dancing lesson, and it's all been stopped because of the pandemic, because, you can't have social distancing when you're trying to dance. But it's restarted, and I will, I'm planning to have a go at some competition in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, and of course you participated in Strictly. Would you do any other reality shows, like maybe The Jungle?
No, some of those are just embarrassing. No, I did it because of my interest in dancing. I mean, it was a bit unorthodox because I was a member of the cabinet at the time, but no, it wasn't a wish just to have publicity and exposure for the sake of it. It was something I rather loved doing.
Yeah, and an interesting thing I found out is that you actually learned to fly a plane when you were in Kenya.
That's right. Yeah, I have a long extinct flying license. No, I mean, if you ever want to learn to fly, Kenya is a perfect place to do it because you have a wonderful climate and you can fly over the game parks and the mountains and wonderful blue skies and steady weather. But I just didn't have the money. It's a very expensive hobby, as I soon discovered that I had to drop it subsequently.
Yeah, that's true. And what other hobbies and things do you like to get up to in your spare time?
Well, I mean, given my age, one of my main concerns is keeping fit. So I do a lot of cycling, quite a bit of gym, and walking, mountain walking where possible. So yeah, that's outside of, and I read a lot of novels. That's my main way, relaxing.
And any favourite TV shows at the moment?
Well, we love watching these thrillers. 9 o'clock on a Saturday night, and actually there's one on the BBC at the moment as well. So, yeah, sort of psychological thrillers, good detectives, that kind of stuff. Yes, I enjoy those. And Match of the Day, Match of the Day is unmissable.
Yeah, and favourite TV shows to go on actually as well, like Newsnight and things over the years.
Yes, well, Newsnight is sort of a bit diminished these days. Channel 4 News is good. I mean, I actually used to quite like being interviewed by some of these people like Jeremy Paxman and John Humphreys. I mean, they were tough, but they were satisfying interviews. And when you engage with them, you can have a proper conversation.
Yeah, I think. Do you like to sort of answer the question and give the interviewer what they want?
That is the point, actually. Is that if you answer that question or you try to answer the question, they immediately treat you with more respect than if they think you're just some politician who's come on to waffle.
Yeah.
So that's key, actually. That's what we have to do.
What do you think the Lib Dems have to do now to gain more support? Because I don't think support is where it was before the coalition.
No, it isn't. And we've had 3 now bad elections, and it's quite difficult to recover from that. And I think the answer is partly rebuilding the base in local government. And I think the second is developing some kind of tactical understanding with the other opposition parties, mainly the Labour Party. So I think, a bit more with this government than people will be desperate to get rid of them. Yeah. And they will vote for the opposition party that's the best chance of winning. And there are, large number of constituencies around the country, say a minimum of 30 in addition to the 12 we have, which could go Lib Dem. And that's how I think we will make headway.
Yes. And are there any plans for you to root back to politics, maybe the House of Lords, or is that you?
No, I have no wish to go to the House of Lords. So the cronyism is not good, and I'd rather not do it. I've got plenty of other things to do. I'm writing books. I've done 3 books in the lockdown, and I'm going around book festivals, promoting them, and do a bit of teaching at the London School of Economics, and I'm involved in a business promoting the rolling out of hydrogen infrastructure. So I'm very fully employed, mostly voluntary, but I'm very, very busy, and I've certainly no wish to go to the House of Lords.
Yeah. Well, where are we able to keep up to date with you? Do you tweet, for example?
Occasionally, yeah. I have quite a lot of followers. I've got a podcast, which I hope people will subscribe to, based on an article I write every week for The Independent.
Great. Well, just as we go, is there a particular song that we can play for you?
You've rather caught me on the hop there. No, I was a great. My generation, right? I sort of come from the generation of Elvis Presley, and the ballads. The ballads. He was a very good voice. That generation, Elvis, the Everly Brothers, or the Beatles. So anything around there would appeal to me.
Okay, I'll find something for you then. Well, thanks for coming on today, Sir Vince. It's been great to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.